Good evening, everyone. I'm Brent Glass, Executive Director of the Sing Sing Prison Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's program. The mission of the Sing Sing Prison Museum is to tell the story of 200 years of incarceration at one of America's most famous and most historic active prisons. And our mission is also to challenge all of us to imagine a more equitable criminal justice system in America and to take action to build a more just society. And in that spirit, we have created a series of programs, webinars, called Justice Talks. And tonight's program is on the subject of wrongful convictions, a subject that's very timely, unfortunately, but it has been in the news quite a bit. 60 Minutes several weeks ago had a segment on this subject. Even this evening, then on All Things Considered on National Public Radio, there was a segment on wrongful convictions. And in the Sunday New York Times, there was another extensive article on this subject. We are going to have a short video and then a panel discussion. I want to thank the staff of the Sing Sing Prison Museum, Victoria Gonzalez and Nicole Hamilton, who are producing this program. I also want to thank the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation and the Wilson Center for Science and Justice at Duke University as our sponsors for this evening's program, and recognize the board of directors of the Sing Sing Prison Museum, who provide great support for our program. One of our board members, Sam North, is our moderator and host for this evening. Sam is a faculty member at Ossining High School and also a board member of the Peekskill School District and a board member of the Sing Sing Prison Museum. So Sam, I'm pleased to turn the program over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent, and good evening and welcome to this installment of Justice Talks. I'm very excited to be able to bring this program to you, and I also want to thank the Sing Sing Prison Museum Board and especially the staff members who have behind the scenes have made this possible. We're very excited to be able to introduce the short film Conviction by Jia Wertz. Conviction tells the story of Jeffrey Deskovic, who in 1989 was wrongfully convicted and incarcerated for the rape and murder of a 15-year-old high school classmate. He spent 16 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. In 2006, Jeffrey was exonerated when DNA evidence collected from the crime scene was matched to the real murderer. Jeffrey's story is an indictment of our justice system as well as a triumph of the human spirit. And after the screening, we will have the unique opportunity to have a moderated discussion with Jeffrey Deskovic, Jia Wertz, and Professor Brandon Garrett from the Wilson Center for Science and Justice. We are welcome questions from the audience. We'll have a moderated discussion after we see the film, and then we will also be fielding questions from the audience. If you have a question, you can pose it through the Q&A button, and we will take those and be asking them at the end of our moderated discussion. So thank you so much for being here, and enjoy Conviction, and we'll be back at the end of this short film.
These two men got out of a car and they had on long trench coats, and they called my name, and I paused and stopped and said, "Yeah, who are you?" And they told me that they were big skilled detectives. They would pretend like they needed my help to solve the crime. At the time of the crime, she was 15. I was 16. The career I wanted to have when I grew up was to be a cop. So this unexpected early opportunity to do this quasi-police work was, it made me feel good. I didn't actually realize that I was arrested until later on, I was in the police station. I was charged with murder and rape. I almost couldn't believe it. I almost couldn't believe what my senses and what my mind was telling me. I spent 16 years in prison. The police spoke to a lot of students in the high school, and some of them told the police they might want to talk to me because I was quiet and to myself and I didn't really fit in there. And the second thing was they interpreted my being emotional as like a sign of like if I was regretting what I did, like I felt sorry for what I did, so they interpreted my emotional reaction to the victim's death as a sign of guilt. And then a third factor was they got a psychological profile from the NYPD, and I happened to fit that psychological profile, so that was kind of a reinforcing factor. When I entered the state prison, and I remember how large the prison wall loomed and how big the barbed wire was, and the vehicle was rolling me into the prison, and the idea of going into an environment where the correction officers rather than civilians were in charge was fairly terrifying. I would say another time was when I learned that some of the prisoners in the facility where I was at, Shawangunk, that they had gone to the law library and made photocopies of my case. There's a vigilante mentality towards people who are convicted of sex offenses. And so when I learned that people had made copies of the case and were passing them out to people, I mean, that with virtually the whole facility becoming hostile, that was a pretty frightening moment. I was in solitary confinement, so I remember just the culmination of circumstances. That I was in solitary confinement, that I was given a 28-day sentence to be in there because I was defending myself against prisoners who, were coming to stab me because as far as they were concerned, I was a sex offender. And while there, I got the news that I lost in federal court because the court clerks had given my lawyer the wrong information regarding the filing procedure. When I lost the last appeal, which meant I was permanently locked out of the court unless I could somehow find some new evidence, which, given that I no longer had representation and I was in prison and that my family had no money to hire a lawyer, I mean, the odds of that happening seemed fairly remote. About 5 years after that, so my appeals were over, I wrote letters for 4 years looking for help to try to hope I could find a lawyer or an investigator to take my case for free to then try to find some new evidence. And the 4 years went by without my very rarely getting an answer other than no. So I felt pretty certain at that point that I was going to die in prison for a crime I didn't commit, and that was pretty frightening as well. Being in solitary confinement, I had to try to quiet my mind. It was kind of in a panic type of mode, but the lights were on all the time, so and there was no clock, so I never had any conception of what time it was other than of breakfast items happened to be served on the food tray. So I used very little property in your cell. There's no privacy. It's just a cage, but at the same time, there's just a row of cells. You actually can't see anybody else. Anytime you leave the cell for any reason, they handcuff you first. Your hygienic items are just kept in a locker with your name on it, so you can only actually have access to those when you are allowed out to take a shower. I really didn't like being in handcuffs, so after a while when they would, I remember the recreational area, they just put you in a small caged area outside. You really couldn't even see up you couldn't see the sky. So after a while, I just stopped going. I felt like the inconvenience of being in the handcuffs to get there wasn't worth what the actual recreation was. That was really tough, just looking at the ceiling. You know, violence was considered to be a everyday thing of life in there, to the point that it almost didn't bother anybody. That was kind of crazy to me. I mean, I hated living in an environment where violence was part of the everyday, what goes on every day. And I tried to limit my interaction with people, and when you see violence going on, you kind of look the other way and don't give like a visual reaction. You know, if a problem comes to you, you have to try to stand up for yourself. You have to defend yourself. You know, win, lose, or draw. But I think that the people that don't stand up for themselves, that becomes into an even bigger problem. My relationship with my family was that I really didn't have a lot of interaction with my extended family. I would see them every couple of years, but it really wasn't a close interaction. So I think that it made it even more distant, and having to enter a prison and go through the metal detector and the other processes involved certainly was a discouraging factor. So I think that it made the situation worse. I saw my brother like 3 times in like 16 years, not at all in the last decade. I had actually placed an ad in a newspaper, in the Sacramento Bee, actually. And I was looking for like a pen pal, and just having the other lifeline to the outside to just correspond with was a big help. I mean, I was openly asking him in different letters, look, do you think I should quit this? Or do you think that, I should just commit suicide, just be done with everything? I'm never going to get out of here. That kind of thing. And so he encouraged me to keep going. It was in the morning, and the prison guard opened up my cell, and I remember thinking along the way, who the hell came to see me? So I come in the visiting room, and I went up to the desk where the officer was stationed at, and there's this woman who's waving at me, and I don't recognize her, and I just kind of nod my head, and I'm just thinking, well, who is that? So I asked the guard, well, where's my visitor at? And so she points at the lady and looks at me like I'm nuts. She said, what, don't you know who that is? And I just said, yeah. I just said yes reflexively. I didn't want her to cancel the visit, so I just feigned my way through that yes. And she stood up and shook my hand and introduced herself as my attorney. And then she said to me, the items that we've been waiting to get tested have been tested. And then she quickly said, it matched the actual perpetrator. You're going home tomorrow. And I said, no, I'm not. I had this 3.5 hour type of mental paralysis where my head was kind of spinning, and every now and then she would cut in and say, are you ready to talk about tomorrow? And I was like, no, keep that away from me. I'm not, no, that's not, don't play with me that way. It's not, I'm not going home. We're not talking about, not entertaining that.
How did you end up killing him?
Strangling.
Was it during the sex? Was it after the sex?
Yeah, it was during, and like a rage.
What was it? What did she do? I mean, talk about the cocaine makes you aggressive, but what did she do that put you into that rage?
Nothing at all.
Do you remember her telling you to stop? Do you remember anything? Is that because she didn't do it, or because your condition, you blocked it out?
Blocked out. I guess I blocked it out. She could have, probably did, more than likely.
I mean, I'm 45 physically, but I don't feel 45. I feel more like I'm 25, 26, but so there is that challenge to deal with. I still have certain aspects of my life that I'm trying to put together, which, having been those things kind of like the train was kind of knocked off the tracks a little bit as a result of the experience. So, there is that, and I wouldn't say I'm 100% free of the after effects of my experience. On the other hand, I do feel like I have a clear-cut mission in life. When I realized, that I could be part of the innocence movement without necessarily being a lawyer. So that kind of launched me doing my advocacy work, which has as its goal freeing wrongfully convicted people and working for policy changes. I appreciate the small things. Just from the fresh air, the sun on my face, to be outside in the nighttime, to freedom of movement. Don't have that many activity partners now. I still want to throw a ball around or go to an amusement park or travel or nightlife or all these different things. And but most people my age, they've been there and done that already. That's not on their agenda anymore. So it's it's hard to find people to do things with. The other part of my social life, I would say, my dating life has been difficult, maybe because of my background. So, what do you do? How'd you get into that? You seem kind of passionate. What's the backstory? And it's only a short 3-4 questions before the whole thing is out there, and so that's proven to be kind of a challenge. You were in prison for 16 years wrongfully. Sure, yeah, you were innocent. But you were there for 16 years. How much of that rubbed off on you? Is it safe to be alone someplace with you? So there is that stigmatic aspect to it. Some people have thought that maybe I've come with too much baggage as after effects of my experience. So there was somebody that I was dating at the time that was a psychologist, and she was like, well, look, I deal with people's problems all day, and then I'm empathetic, and, by the time the day is over, I've had enough. I need to unwind, relax, accept that, I have an understanding of what the trauma is you went through, and I'm empathetic, and so is this too much for me? I think that you have a lot of after effects, and that would be a bit much for me to take on in light of what I'm doing already every day. It frustrates me because if I hadn't been wrongfully imprisoned, I don't perceive that any of these things would be obstacles. At the end of the day, I'm still the one that is missing out. I'm still the one thinking about or wondering, well, what if? And I have to say that that's not a very good feeling. I would hope that they would look at me as being just as innocent as they are. I'm the same as them, except that I was arrested for something that I didn't do and they were not. I can't forget about the people that I left behind. That I would be in effect walking away from everybody and everything, and knowing that for a lot of people there isn't any help. Not just the wrongful conviction, but everything I saw while I was there. From in terms of how the prison system is, how the parole system is, the prisoner reentry, even taking college education away from prisoners, even though that prisoners with a college education have a much lower recidivism rate, and therefore that should be viewed as a very serious crime-fighting tool. I think and then even while I was in prison, from seeing people there who didn't belong there, putting guilt, innocence aside for a minute, there were a lot of people there for nonviolent offenses that I didn't feel needed to be there. There was people over there that were over-sentenced. There were a lot of people there for drug possession, not as a drug dealer, but as a drug user. And some of them were doing more time than people that were there for killing people. That was backwards to me. There were a lot of prisoners there who were guilty, who made no bones about that, but that, their crime was 10, 15 years ago. They were model prisoners. Some of them were, had been in very little trouble. Some of them were living in honor block, and and yet they were, they still had another 5, 10 years to go, and it didn't appear to me that any good was going to come out of just continuing to incarcerate them. For what? The only Only thing different is they're just gonna be older. And then I saw a lot of elderly people in prison that had, the prison really wasn't able to keep up with their needs. People on dialysis and hunched over and in wheelchairs, and I mean, even they have hospice in some prisons. I mean, all of that's backwards to me. What is the point of continuing to incarcerate somebody at that point? What is it, vengefulness at that point? Is it just revenge? Well, then that's just the mob rule. That's just mob rule then. So I saw, so all of those things are troublesome. I mean, I saw people who they put in for what is called compassionate release, which is when it's certified that they're terminally ill, they can put in for the compassionate release so that they can spend the last couple of days or however long they have, that they could, die with their family free. And I've seen people put in for that, and by the time the system works its way around to making a decision, they already passed away. I saw that happen a few times. I've seen it happen that by the time they got released, word reaches back to prison that they, passed away at another day or two after that. But it took a really long time to process it, and the system just seems to be bureaucratic and uncaring at every turn. And I can't believe that it's incompetence. I know it's not. Nobody can be that silly. No one can be that. I'm feeling much more stronger words than what I'm saying right now, but I'm just keeping my composure. But I think everyone understands what I'm trying to get at, and I don't understand. The purpose of prison is supposed to be to punish somebody for a crime that they committed. The punishment is supposed to be the loss of freedom. It's not supposed to be, mistreatment while you're there. It's not supposed to be you're now subjected to an uncaring and indifferent and unempathetic and cold environment, but yet that's what goes on, and nobody seems to care, because why should we? They're just prisoners, right? It's disgusting. But I decided maybe after the first week that I was home that I didn't want to be angry or bitter. I felt like I wanted to live a meaningful life, and enjoy my life as much as I could, and I didn't feel like I could do that if I was angry or bitter. Another thing is that I felt like I already had lost so much as it was. Why would I want to lose the rest of my life? And I kind of thought that maybe my best revenge was to live my best life. I just graduated law school, but I did that at 45. Go straight through, you would be finished around 24, 25.
One of your classmates understands the impact of the criminal justice system's treatment of the accused from firsthand experience. When he was 17 years old, Jeffrey Deskovic was convicted of a crime he did not commit. Actually convicted of several crimes he did not commit. 16 long years later, after many legal battles, his indictment was dismissed on the grounds of actual innocence. Post-conviction DNA testing proved his innocence and identified the real perpetrator of the crime. Today, he will walk across this stage 9 blocks from the county courthouse where he was finally exonerated and get his law degree. We are incredibly proud of Jeffrey, not only for working hard over the past 3 years to get his JD, but also for providing an example to all of us about the importance of resilience, perseverance, and hard work. Jeffrey, I salute you.
Okay, well, thank you for watching that. It's an extraordinary short, and I can just as a quick teaser, I know that Jia Wertz, the filmmaker, is putting the finishing touches on a full-length version of Conviction, so we'll certainly be on the lookout for that. Okay, we're going to enter into the moderated discussion portion of our evening tonight, and again, I want to remind you that there is a quick Q&A button that you can submit questions for towards the end. We will take some of the questions from those of you that are with us tonight and pose them to our panelists. But let me first just introduce our three extraordinary and distinguished panelists. We have, of course, Jeffrey Deskovic, Esquire, who is the subject of the film. He's also the founder of the Jeffrey Deskovic Foundation for Justice and an advisory board member of the organization It Could Happen to You, and also a global advisory council for the Restorative Justice International Organization. The Deskovic Foundation is a nonprofit organization dedicated to the exoneration of wrongfully convicted, their recovery, and reform of the system that allows these miscarriages of justice to take place. To date, the foundation has freed 10 wrongfully convicted people and helped to pass 7 laws aimed at preventing wrongful conviction. It continues to do extraordinary work under Jeffrey's leadership. Jia Wertz, who is the writer, director, producer of Conviction, which amazingly is her first film. She's currently, as I mentioned, putting the finishing touches on the full-length version of Conviction. The film the short has garnered critical and audience acclaim and recently won Best Picture at the Georgia Shorts Film Festival and the Best Cinematography at the Georgia Documentary Film Festival, both in 2020, and also an award of distinction at the Canada Shorts Film Festival in 2020. In addition, Jia Wertz is a featured writer for Forbes magazine and co-host of the Speaking of Crime podcast, as well as the founder and fashion designer of Studio 15, a socially responsible fashion brand. We are also very fortunate to have Professor Brandon Garrett with us tonight. Professor Garrett is the director of the Wilson Center for Science and Justice at Duke University School of Law and author of numerous books, including 2011's Convicting the Innocent, Where Criminal Prosecution Goes Wrong. His work has been widely cited by courts, including the United States Supreme Court and courts in other countries, such as the Supreme Courts of Canada and Israel. Professor Garrett also frequently speaks about criminal justice matters before legislative and policy-making bodies, groups of practicing lawyers, law enforcement, and local and national media. He's involved with a number of law reform initiatives, including the American Law Institute's Project on Policing, for which he serves as associate reporter. So I'm going to start actually with Professor Garrett, if that's okay. Professor Garrett, in your book, Convicting the Innocent, you painstakingly examine the cases of the first 250 DNA-related exonerations. Can you tell us, first of all, how you became interested in wrongful conviction cases, and then just give us a sense of the scope of the problem of wrongful conviction in the U.S. today?
Sure, thank you, Sam. And it's a real honor and treat to be here with Jeffrey and with Jia. I'm very excited to see the full-length version of this film. You know, I couldn't but tried to do a little bit of justice to Jeffrey's story in just a handful of pages in my Convicting the Innocent book. But I was trying to tell the story really of 250 cases, the first 250 DNA exonerations in this country, but there have been more than 370 now, and there are thousands more cases on the National Registry of Exonerations, which include many cases that result in exonerations without the benefit of DNA. I first got into this business as a young lawyer. I wanted to do police accountability work. I'd been working with homeless people who were getting arrested, beaten, otherwise humiliated by police. I wanted to do policing work. I had no interest in learning about DNA or forensics or false confessions or wrongful convictions. I just wanted to do something about policing. I was in the position that, many young people are in today, after George Floyd was killed. And at the time it was, Abner Louima, Amadou Diallo. I was, young and seeing these abuses, and homeless people that I'd gotten to know were suffering the same. I didn't really know much about, criminal trials or plea bargaining or any of that stuff. Policing is sort of more accessible because it's street interactions. My first job as a lawyer, because they were doing amazing police brutality cases as well, was a job with the law firm of Johnny Cochran, Barry Scheck, and Peter Neufeld. And Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld founded the Innocence Project. It's mostly working with them. And while I told them I really want to work on policing cases, over time they were kind of like, well, this person wasn't shot by the police, but this man falsely confessed. We'd like to bring a complaint. At that time, exonerees often didn't have many places to turn in terms of lawyers willing to take their cases to fight for compensation after they had, like Jeffrey, spent so many years wrongly imprisoned. And so I started working on, I started, you have to write the complaint, and you talk to your client about what it was like to falsely confess. And that was really eye-opening for me. In fact, the very first case, and this is the one quick story I want to tell, I don't want to talk too long, but it's so fitting that the first case where I ever questioned a witness as a lawyer, it's called a deposition, like it's not in court, but there's a court reporter there, it's on the record, it was at Sing Sing. And it was a client who had been exonerated by DNA out of an assault on Staten Island. But before he was released, the prosecutors were trying to object to the exoneration, I guess, to say, well, we have 2 jailhouse informants that say that he bragged about how the DNA was misleading because actually he had some other guy with him who committed the assault, and must be that guy's DNA. And, this is a sort of mystery second culprit sort of theory. And so, we were going to go talk to the jailhouse informants, and one of them was still in Sing Sing. No, the whole idea was ridiculous. The victim had always said that there was one person, because she was looking up at him, she was on the ground, and he bit her hand and scratched her face. The DNA was from the bite mark and from the scratch. Like, there was definitely one person. It was kind of a foolish theory, and it didn't go anywhere. He was readily exonerated. But in the lawsuit seeking compensation, we wanted to find out, what did this person say? Anyway, I was very, very, very nervous because I'd never prepared for a deposition before. And the partner in the case, Peter Neufeld, he's like a really busy person, right? With the Innocence Project and all the cases he was working on. So I kept trying to find time to meet with him to say, okay, can we plan this thing out? I'm trying to think about what questions I should ask. And he was kind of like, oh yeah, we'll find time. Anyway, so basically, we were driving to Sing Sing, and I was kind of like, okay, so what's the plan? And so I was underprepared. I didn't know how to prepare for a deposition. And the funniest part to me now was that the jailhouse informant told me that I should really calm down, that it was going to be okay. When we sat down there in front of the court reporter, I was the one, the questioner, who just seemed, I just sweating bullets. What do I do first? Do I say my name? Do I? Anyway, he readily said that, no, your client was always proclaiming his innocence. He was well known for telling everyone he met that he was innocent. And so, whatever had been reported was not what this person remembered having heard. It was a very comfortable deposition. But the jailhouse informant, who turned out not to be one actually, was the one telling me to relax.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn now to Jia, because I hope you all don't mind if I use your first names. Is that all right? I feel like I know you all. Well, I know Jia and Jeffrey. It's a great honor to meet you, Professor Garrett. Now I'm going to start calling you Brandon. Jia, can you tell us a little bit about how you became interested in wrongful convictions, and also the story of how you kind of happened onto Jeffrey's story and decided to tell that? And Jeff, while she's responding, I'm going to come back at you and ask you next. When you first heard that Jia was thinking about telling your story, I'm curious to know what your thoughts were. So, Jia, can you start us off by just letting us know how you got into this, telling the story?
Yeah, for sure. A long, long time ago, when I was about 20, I read a book by Reuben Carter called The 16th Round, which till this day is still my favorite book that I've ever read. And I was really young, and I read his words just stuck with me. Just was so heartbreaking that he could be wrongfully convicted. And, for anyone that doesn't know the story, you should definitely, look it up. He was a famous boxer in the 60s, and he was wrongfully convicted of a murder he didn't commit. And because he wrote the book as kind of his last plea to the public to help him, because he had exhausted his appeals and he just felt like he was going to die in prison, it was a very just raw account of what a human goes through. And it just never left my mind. And ever since I read that book, I was really passionate about wrongful convictions, but it kind of just stayed in the back of my mind. I was young and went on to have a whole career in the fashion industry for 2 decades. And then in 2014 or 2015, when Serial came out, I listened to the podcast, and just all the same thoughts I had, in the back of my mind just came flooding back. And the subject of Serial, Adnan, I believe in his innocence completely. And I thought, while Serial was very entertaining for everybody, the world was captivated, there was somebody who was innocent just sitting in prison. And I thought, well, this is not entertainment. This is somebody's life. And so I thought I wanted to do something to help him. So I organized a fundraiser in New York City with a friend of mine, and was just wanting to raise some funds for his legal defense fund. And in the process, I was looking for a speaker at my event, because I am not an expert on wrongful convictions, and I wanted somebody who was. And my friend introduced me to Jeff. She said, Jeff has a really similar story to Adnan. He was, also 16. It was also his classmate that was murdered. He's innocent. And I said, yeah, I'd absolutely love to meet him. And she introduced Jeff and I. So that's how Jeff and I met. And the funny thing about how the film came to be is 4 years later, I was at Adnan's post-conviction hearing when they overturned his conviction. And I saw a camera crew there, and they were filming the HBO documentary called The Case Against Adnan Syed. And I saw them filming, and I had 20-year experience in photography. And so with my naive self, I was like, hey, there's just 3 people here filming an HBO doc. I can do this. And I promptly went home and enrolled at New York Film Academy and thought, I know how to work a camera. This is how I'm going to help the cause. And at that time, Jeff was the only person I knew personally who had been through this. And so I reached out to him and said, hey, I'm going to make a film. It's going to be a short film. Are you interested? And he said yes right away. And off we went. And never did I think that, we would be here and have this much interest in the film when I was making it just a year ago.
Thanks so much. It's such a compelling story. Jeff, I'm just curious to hear your thoughts when Jia first approached you, and also, how you feel about the film now that it is out there.
Yeah, so I remember when Gia, approached me, she spoke to me about it. So it was kind of like a weird scenario, because I had spoken at her event, and then I had spoken at a much larger fundraising event for Adnan, which Gia attended as an audience member, and we were friendly. So I remembered her from them, and I remember there was a positive vibe with her. So when she said to me, she wanted to make a documentary, I mean, I get approached all the time. People say that to me like a million times a day, and usually I never hear from them again. So I had that thought in my head, but then I also remembered that history. And so I remember saying, yeah, I'm interested, and just thinking, well, I'll probably never hear from her again, but if I do, we'll play this out, and, I'll go to get the footage that she needs, and we'll see where, if anywhere, it went. But, after I saw her for like the 3rd time, it was pretty clear, she had all types of cameras and everything, and people helping her, that she was much different than everyone else. And she was taking this very serious, and I just went along with it. And I never imagined that it would take on the life of its own that it has, being selected in 11 film festivals, or winning these different awards. And it's led to Gia doing quite a bit of media work, and I'm getting a lot of media coverage out of it as well. So I never imagined that all this stuff would happen.
Jia, the film, the short at least, does not get into the details, the nitty-gritty sort of the crime, the arrest, trial, conviction. Was that intentional?
Yeah, it was intentional only because I was making a short. When you make a short, you have to really focus on one central question that you're going to answer for the audience. And for me, that question was, how is somebody who's innocent impacted by a wrongful conviction, and how do they reintegrate into society? So I really focused everything on that one question. The thing about shorts is Jeff's story is, so there's so many layers and there's just so much to it. You could never fit it into a short. And if you did, it would be a very poorly made film because he would touch so briefly on such big, important topics. And so I chose to focus on that one aspect for many reasons. Some was circumstance because I had access to Jeff and I didn't have access to a lot of the other things, whether it be news stories or crime scene photos. And then secondly, I also have a really, just personally, a little issue, I guess, with crime scene photos and things like that, because I would only ever want access to them if the victim's family was okay with it, because I never forget that there's somebody else in this story who, if these people ever see the film, they'll be impacted and have to be hurt all over again. So I didn't want to go there either. So but I will say with the feature length film, it goes much deeper into wrongful convictions, and I should say false confessions, and how they happen and the psychology behind them, and why the DNA wasn't tested in Jeff's case, and why did Janine Pirro not allow that, and all the other things that went wrong. So it'll dive much deeper into those other aspects.
Thank you. Jeff, I was hoping that for those people in the audience that are not familiar with some of the details, could you give us some of the, fill in some of those blanks for our audience who aren't familiar with your case?
Yeah, that the wrongful conviction was caused by a coerced false confession, prosecutorial misconduct, fraud by the medical examiner, terrible public defender. Basically, I was interrogated for 6.5 to 7 hours, just, featuring threats and false promise, and being, given countless cups of coffee and wired up to a machine, good cop, bad cop. So, I mean, that's one aspect. Most people don't realize that the DNA excluded me before the trial, but the prosecutor was willing to trash the victim's reputation by getting the medical examiner to falsely say that she was promiscuous. So there was that aspect to it. My lawyer never really made use of the DNA, never called my alibi as a witness. I did lose 7 appeals. I got turned down for parole largely because I maintained my innocence. So I mean, those are some of the details that, just the players and people involved. I mean, the larger picture will speak with my lawyer and other people who played critical roles. So it'll have that aspect of it. But look, I'm really super happy that it does focus on my advocacy and life afterwards, because I'm an advocate, and I take myself very seriously. And my backstory might be that I'm an exoneree, and that motivates me, but I'm much more than just an exoneree. I am an advocate, and I conduct myself that way. And I measure myself versus other people in the field.
Yeah, Jeffrey, I completely agree. One of the things I love about the short is how much it focuses on the work that you are doing now, and the triumph of, getting out and creating this foundation and going on to get your law degree. And, it's an extraordinary story. I do want to, if you don't mind, just take you back for 1 minute to the false confession element here, because it is a big part of many wrongful conviction cases. And I think a lot of people, would benefit from understanding kind of how that happened. And just to remind folks that you were 16 years old when you were being interrogated by the police. So if you could just elaborate a little bit more on how what were some of the police tactics that led you down the path to making that false confession?
Sure. So I had interaction with them for about 6 weeks, and they would talk to me as a suspect initially, and then when they would push too hard in each interview and I would get scared, they would then Jeff as this junior detective helper theme was what they played up, and that's how they would keep me there. And so ultimately they got me to agree to take a lie detector test. They said, look, we got some new information in the file, we want to share that with you. You just have to pass the polygraph first. And so the next day I went to the police station instead of the high school. My mother and grandmother thought that I was in school. They drove me across county lines. It was about 40 minutes away by car. So now I'm dependent on the cops, and they give me countless cups of coffee. and wire me up, and then they attached me to the polygraph machine, and they launched into their third-degree tactics. I mean, the polygraphist, let me just say this, he was actually a Putnam County Sheriff's investigator. He was dressed like a civilian. He never identified himself as a police officer. And they didn't give me anything to eat the entire time I was there. I didn't have an attorney. And when they attached the polygraph machine, he launched into his tactics. So he invaded my personal space. He raised his voice at me. He kept asking the same questions over and over again. And he kept that up for 6.5 to 7 hours. Finally, he said, "What do you mean you didn't do it? You just told me through the test, the result that you did. We just want you to confirm it." You know, and then that really shot my fear through the roof. And then the cop who had been pretending to be my friend, he came in the room and told me that the other officers were going to harm me, but that he had been holding them off, but he couldn't do that any longer. Look, just tell them what they want to hear. They'll stop what they're doing. You can go home afterwards. You're not going to be arrested. So being young, naive, frightened, 16 years old, not thinking about the long term, just being concerned with my safety in the moment, I was in fear of my life. The fact that I didn't know where I was and no one else knew either was pretty large in my mind, you know, and I just wanted to get out of there. And so I made up a story based on that information that they had given me in the course of that interrogation. And by the time it was all said and done, I collapsed onto the floor in a fetal position. I was crying uncontrollably.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It really helps people to kind of understand a little bit about this. And now I want to just ask Brandon, if you could jump in here. You know, Jeffrey has described some of the tactics that were used by investigators in this case. And I know that in your, you know, I was looking through some of your work, and in your 2015 Virginia Law Review article, you wrote about false confessions. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about, you know, are these typical tactics that are used by police, number one, and number two, can you just sort of give us an overview of what your research tells us about wrongful, the role that false confessions play in wrongful convictions?
Yeah, well, I think a really good place to start is, you know, you just heard what Jeffrey said. You just watched the short film, and put yourself in the position of the jurors at the trial or these judges, right? Jeffrey's talking about how multiple appellate judges all said, "Oh, no problem," they affirmed the conviction. Like, how could that be? This looks like, I mean, it's just such an outrageous injustice when we look at it through our eyes today. How could they possibly have believed that this was a sound and voluntary confession? Jeffrey just described what these police officers did to torture him. And what's really important to understand about false confessions is if all the jury saw was a kid being abused by these police officers, a kid who knew nothing about this offense, was trying to help. And what the jury heard, though, and what we saw judges say on appeal was, well, oh, wait a minute. Okay, this may have been a lengthy interrogation. That raises hackles, raises constitutional concerns if you're repeatedly interrogating someone who's young. But, you know, what the prosecutor emphasized in closing arguments, what the judge emphasized in opposing sentence, appellate court said there's overwhelming evidence of guilt because the police reported that he had offered facts that only, you know, the killer would have known, inside information. And we know now that this was a contaminated confession. Jeffrey could have known any of this stuff. And similarly, in the 60+ innocent people, all cleared by DNA, almost without exception in those cases, detectives claimed that this innocent person had volunteered details that only the true killer or assailant could have known. They were not made available to the press. There was no other way to know this unless you were there, or unless the law enforcement fed you each of those facts to make it appear that this false confession was corroborated. But what the jury heard was a really, really detailed confession statement. They heard details about, you know, how the victim had been injured and this Gatorade bottle on the path, and you know, details about the crime scene, notations on a diagram. And you see this in every one of these cases. It's not enough to beat someone down in an interrogation room until they say, "Whatever it is, I did it. You tell me." That's not compelling to the jury. It's this contamination, which is really, really insidious. You're putting words, you're putting facts, the most important facts concerning how a crime happened, in the mouth of an innocent person. That's something that's really like, it's one step for the public to understand false confessions happen. They've been documented. Many of them have been documented in this country, and they don't involve brutal beatings necessarily. They involve really disturbing police psychological tactics. But number two, not only can someone say, fine, just if you let me out of this room, I did it. They can offer details carefully fed to them by law enforcement that make it seem like they knew exactly how the crime happened. And this confession contamination problem is a really disturbing one. You can try to unravel it if you actually have a recording of an entire interrogation, and that's why more states as a reform have started to pass legislation to require recordings of entire interrogations. But you even have terrible cases like Brendan Dassey's case, where there's a recording and you see them feeding all these facts. And even still, it's hard to get around the idea that an innocent person would confess. And the awareness has been growing over the past few decades, but it's still not there yet. You know, people who falsely confess, and you can see the contamination even in a video, still get convicted to this day in this country. And so, you know, as researchers, we document this phenomena. Increasingly, experts are allowed in court to explain how this happens. Hopefully that will start to help, but it's still a really severe problem because of these tactics quite commonly used by law enforcement. Finally, there is a movement to reform police tactics and training and policies in terms of how they do interrogations. And that's really important too. It's good if there's a video record, but we don't want a video record of abusive and misleading and contaminated tactics. We want police to do the right thing and gather information correctly from the beginning. And fortunately, some more agencies have started to embrace a different model for questioning witnesses designed to gather information and not put words in people's mouths.
Sam, I'd like to quickly piggyback something really, I'll be really fast. Just coerced false confessions have caused wrongful convictions in 25% of the DNA proven wrongful convictions. Particularly vulnerable populations are youth and people with mental health issues, which I was in one of those categories. I also want to add that my interrogation was not videotaped. It was not audio taped. There was no signed confession. It was just the cop's word for it. And as a result of that, when they came to court to testify, they left the threat and false promise out of their testimony. And just for New Yorkers, I want to mention, you know, that one of the reforms that my foundation and It Could Happen to You coalition that we're working for right now has to do with removing the exceptions to the rule that mandates police to videotape interrogation. So we're working on that, and we're working on repassing the Commission on Prosecutor Conduct, so the Independent Oversight Board. And we can't forget about the role of the prosecutor in this either.
And is, Jeffrey, is it still pending? I feel like I saw a proposal, at least, to bar the use of deception.
Yeah. No, there's a proposal right now that would also bar deception, and there's also been another law which I haven't read yet, but it directly impacts on the interrogation of juveniles, and that's in New York.
Yeah, it's a corrosive thing for society, and I think it harms the legitimacy of police to have officers that are permitted or maybe even encouraged as a tactic to use deception, to lie to people. You know, these are law enforcement. For them to be manipulating, telling lies, doing misleading things in the space of an interrogation room, mixing truth and fiction, makes it really hard to avoid contaminated confessions and terrible miscarriages of justice result. But it's not, you know, we want our law enforcement to be truthful individuals who are on the right side of the truth. And so I hope that these deceptive tactics are barred in many states, and hopefully in New York, lawmakers will learn from Jeffrey's experience, and unfortunately quite a few others just in New York State, and finally address this terrible problem.
Brandon, there's been, I believe, and maybe Jeffrey, you know something about this too, there are court cases though that have ruled on essentially allowing deception as a police practice. Is that not?
Oh yeah. Yeah, I mean, the constitutional standard is really broad. It's just sort of, unless given all the circumstances, the person's will wasn't totally overborne, the confession statement comes in, and basically judges are really reluctant to exclude confessions. I mean, detectives normally do a confession because they don't have better evidence, and it's often, you know, a murder where the victim is the one who saw what happened and cannot tell tales, and so, you know, the judge understands that if you throw out the confession, then there's no case. And you're going to throw out a murder case, no, we'll let the jury weigh it. And, but they, in the past, they often wouldn't allow the jury the information that they really needed to properly weigh it, whether it's an expert to explain how false confessions happen or jury instructions. And, confessions are incredibly prejudicial. Just knowing that someone confessed makes it really hard to look around any of the other gaps in the evidence. And there've been great research on that. It also distorts everything else that people think, whether it's the forensic analysts, they may do their work differently knowing that someone confessed. Other leads may not be followed up. We see this all the time that detectives themselves, they stop investigating once they get a confession. There may have been really, really solid alibi witnesses. We don't need to talk to them. We got a confession. And so they're terribly corrosive. And, but judges have been incredibly hands-off.
Jeffrey, it sounds to me like that's what happened in your case, because I think that when people, hear about your case and they hear that it went back as far as 1989, they might think that maybe there was no DNA evidence, but there was in your case.
Yeah, there was DNA, which didn't match me, and just the fact that a confession could overcome that, was it really speaks to the power of what Brandon was saying, and I think that definitely plays an impact in terms of the appellate judges. I mean, often when you read the case summaries of exonerations, whether on the National Registry of Exoneration or the Innocence Project, there were quite a bit of red flags along the way, particularly, in the confessions, and no judge ever put the brakes on or enforced, enforced constitutional rights by ruling that, a confession was involuntary.
Thank you so much. I want to bring Jia back into the conversation. This is such an important work. I just want to, what are you hoping that the impact of this film will be or will have on this issue?
That's changing quickly, I guess, because when I first ventured into making the film, my goal was just to raise awareness for this cause. I always have noticed that for people who haven't been personally impacted by wrongful conviction, whether it be someone like Jeff or family and friends of those people, the average person doesn't think about this as a cause that needs support or to get behind, just because it's not on their radar for the most part. And so my goal was just to raise awareness that this is a real issue that, we need to get behind and to make changes. Now that the film has gotten some attention and things like this, I would love for it to have a bigger impact than that. But that was my initial goal.
Also, this is an interesting question. I was watching some, videos and different conversations you've had. I was doing a little background research, and you told a story when you were being interviewed by Richard Williams for Film Forums about the first time that you were working with Jeffrey, when you heard him joking about his experience. And I thought it was really kind of a powerful moment. I wonder if you could just recount that story.
Yeah, and it's happened a couple times since, but it was in one of the, I think, second interviews I did with Jeff, and Jeff has a really dark sense of humor, and as do I, and I wasn't expecting it because I only really knew Jeff in a professional setting for the most part, through the fundraisers and things that we had worked together on, and he made this joke. I mean, I'm happy to share it, or Jeff, you can share it if you'd like, but one of his friends was in the room with us, and she said, I have to go to the dentist. It was the middle of filming. It's like, I got to go to the dentist. And she said, it's the worst place to be, or something like that. And Jeff was a little annoyed because there was a lot of we needed to film, and there was just a lot of exterior noise and things going on. And he just kind of snapped back at her and said, or just to everybody, I guess, and said, I can think of a worse place to be. And we have the mic on Jeff, and we're listening to him in our ears, and I did a double take. So did I just hear did he say that? Because everyone else does not have the right to make jokes about this situation. Jeff has the right to make jokes about this situation, but to me, it felt like nobody else did. And I literally just took a step back because I thought, did I hear that right? I mean, it's hilarious, but I had to ask him. I said, what did you say? And then he told me again, and he was laughing about it. And it's one of the things I love about Jeff. He's done that a few times, and I often ask him. I asked him actually in one of the interviews when making the film, is how do you talk about this in such a mundane way, almost like you're asking what he ate for lunch, it feels like. And he can just tell you things that the average person would not even be comfortable talking about, but he can tell it in a very comfortable, easy manner. And what Jeff said to me, and Jeff, you can speak to this, he said that he almost feels like he's talking about somebody else, and he almost compartmentalizes it as a coping mechanism. And it almost seems like he's not talking about his own experience when he's talking about it. So it was just very, very interesting to me. And the psychology of it all, I find very interesting as well. And so, Jeff is a great interview. I always tell him he's like a filmmaker's dream. It's like, he made my job so easy.
Well, I mean, I agree with Gia, and I'll add. I mean, I've told the story so many different ways and so many times, formally, informally, and in just about every format you can imagine. So there's that aspect to it. Another aspect is this. I mean, look, I'm reliving and experiencing really horrific things you would never want to know about, but at the same time, it is healing, it is cathartic, it does make a difference. And on the whole, I feel a lot. I feel better each time I talk about it. Honestly, particularly, I'm warmly received, so I feel some empathy from people, and that's all part of healing as well.
Thank you both. And I think it's very important for all of us to remember there are two victims in this case, right? And that's the big part of this, the tragedy of this story. Jeff, I wanted to just see if you could, I know you mentioned some of your advocacy work that's going on currently, but maybe you could just give us a little bit more on the work of the foundation, because I know that you have multiple aspects of the work that you do. And so I think it's important for people to hear what you're doing now.
So we have 10 active cases now where we're working to free wrongfully convicted people. I mentioned the oversight commission and trying to take out the exceptions to videotaping interrogations. That's in New York. In Pennsylvania, that's one of 15 states that does not have exonerate compensation. So we're working on that over there, as well as, again, trying to have the accountability for the prosecutors. And that's in partnership with our coalition partner, It Could Happen to You, which I'm advisory board member of also. And in California, we're working at, again, the oversight on the prosecutors. I mean, that's big. And, we think there's an opportunity to get rid of capital punishment there. So those are, then we also do a little bit on the recovery side. We do help the exonerees a little bit to the extent we can when they have emergencies that come up. So we try to assist them with that. And we also train the exonerees to engage in the advocacy work with us when meeting with the elected officials. But let me just add one other thing. I'm going to put a link in the chat. There was one question, how can people assist? I mean, if you meet with your elected officials, I mean, that's certainly attending events like this, learning more about wrongful conviction and broader justice reform. And you could host documentaries or movies. I mean, when it's safe, when it's not the pandemic. The other thing is, I mean, we do have a crowdfunding page on Patreon. Imagine 25,000 people could afford $3 or $5 on a recurring monthly basis. That would give us a really nice budget to hire attorneys, investigators, paralegals, other essential personnel. You could increase our capacity so we could take on more cases. We have 7 cases approved that are just waiting in a queue. We're not able to move forward on them because our bandwidth is stretched with the 10 that are active, and we could also work on policy changes. So that's certainly another aspect to it.
Thank you, Jeff. Do you still do karaoke?
I still do. When it was not COVID, I still do karaoke. I call the other exonerees in New York, and we get together. And there's other, we're allowed to bring friends and family, and there is a significant amount of innocence movement people that are like safe for us to just come around us. And I do love doing that as well. You know, in terms of exceptions on videotaping interrogations, that was another question in the chat. So drug cases, sex offense cases, and quite a few different degrees of murder as well. You know, there's exceptions to it. There's way too many exceptions. And, you know, as Brandon was mentioning earlier, if the theory of videotaping interrogations, if that's a critical component of several aspects that we need to prevent coerced false confessions, and if we have exceptions for certain crimes, the rhetorical question is, well, in which of those types of cases would it be acceptable to have a wrongful conviction based on a false confession? And the obvious answer should be none of them. So hence, why the exceptions?
I want to go back to just real quickly. This is really a comment, not a question. I applaud you, not for all of the things that you do, but I think it's especially important for other exonerees and for people who are not yet exonerated to have you as an example in terms of what you have accomplished and the work that you're doing, and also the personal connections that you make with many of these folks. So I really commend you for that. I want to take this opportunity to move. I have a ton of other questions that I had prepared, but we have a really active audience participation with a lot of questions, and I don't want to prolong, make this go much longer than 7:30 at the latest. So I want to move into the Q&A from the audience, if that's all right, because there's a lot of folks that have submitted questions, and we definitely want to give them a chance to have their questions addressed. So the first one, I'm going to start with Jia. Could you tell us a little bit more about the feature-length film?
Yeah, for sure. It is going to be about an hour and a half long, and we're in the very last stages of editing the film. We have 2 shoots left. Actually, one of them being we're hoping to shoot at Sing Sing. So we're trying to work that out once the pandemic is over, and it should be released later this year. We're hoping for a 2021 release. Of course, that depends on distribution and talking to networks and stuff like that, which is what we're working on right now. And I think I talked briefly before about what all the film will entail. It'll go much deeper into Jeff's story, and not just his personal struggles, but more the larger story of how this happens and how it happened to him, and false confessions, and what Jeff's time in prison was like, how it impacted his mom and his family and his friends, and things like that.
Great, thank you. Let's see, we have a question for Brandon. After someone is exonerated, what happens after they're released? Do they have to do parole or anything? Or are they free and just have to try to live like they used to?
Well, in many states, if someone is exonerated, their conviction is vacated. Maybe someone apologizes, maybe not. Nothing happens. More states have passed statutes requiring some form of compensation if someone's been exonerated. But in many states, it's not easy, and it can take litigation or a court process to get compensated. Certainly, some of the cases I worked on, if it's a federal civil rights lawsuit, and that can take years. I was working early on some motion practice in the exonerated fives, federal lawsuit, and I was a law professor. It was like 15 years later when they were finally compensated by the city of New York. And so, anything that involves litigating wrongful conviction issues, even if it's just a compensation lawsuit, the person has already been free, they've already been exonerated. Even in DNA cases, it can take a long, long time. And so you have some people who recover nothing, some people who get something modest because there's a state compensation statute, and some people who get substantial compensation, but many years later. And so, it's a terrible system. I mean, there are lots of problems with our civil rights laws, and obviously back to the cases I worked on when I was a young lawyer, right? Lots of people injured by police, law enforcement, prosecutors in lots of different ways face qualified immunity and all kinds of obstacles to getting meaningful compensation. And so, our focus is on errors in the criminal system, but we also have civil rights laws which are supposed to do something when someone's constitutional rights are violated, and there are real problems on the civil rights side of things as well.
One that just jump in my case in particular, it took 5 years for me to get compensated. When people are exonerated, they're just like released with nothing. I believe that separate and apart from the compensation, that housing, cost of living, doctor and dental care, mental health services, access to public transportation, job training, job placement, class on technology, that all those things should be provided immediately.
There are some questions here about, you can speak, Jeffrey, specifically in your case, and then Brandon, perhaps more broadly, if anything happened to the officers involved in obtaining the false confession in your case, and Brandon, if that's common, if police are ever held accountable in these cases where there is a false confession that is obtained.
Nothing ever happened. I mean, you do sue them individually and you sue the municipality, but honestly, that's not really worth the paper that it's written on. I mean, in reality, the municipality is, who paid for them. If you do take the case all the way to the jury, you need to drop the officers personally anyway, because the danger as a litigant is that the jury will place the blame on the individual officers and not the municipality, and they're not going to have the money to satisfy the judgment. So nothing happened to the cops involved in my case. In fact, the lieutenant who oversaw everything became the Peekskill police chief, in part based on my case. And even after I emerged and was exonerated and I filed suit and his role was known, they still stayed with him as the police chief for another 6 or 7 years. So nobody was held accountable. The closest anybody that was held accountable, it was an indirect thing. So the medical examiner, I brought a claim against the county because he committed fraud. So when I brought suit, he retired suddenly, and 2 weeks before I came home, the prosecutor suddenly retired and ran to Florida. So you have those indirect consequences. But in terms of them paying criminally or even civilly out of their own pocket personally, the answer is no.
And Brandon, do you have any thoughts on whether it's common or uncommon for police to face any kind of consequences?
What happened in Jeffrey's case is entirely typical, and like Jeffrey said, even putting apart, prosecution or criminal charges, just how about an internal inquiry, a review, an audit? We did something terribly wrong. We made a terrible mistake in this policing agency. How did that happen? There's a difference where, if a shooting happens, if an officer discharges a firearm, they may have top brass reviewing the incident the next day. They know that it's not a secret that someone was shot at or shot, and that they're going to be asked questions by the press, that it's a public event. When a wrongful conviction unfolds over years and years, often the relevant people are retired or moved on to other positions, but sometimes they're still there, but it's so many years later. And there's this idea that, policing agencies, they do an investigation, but maybe once they get the confession, you hand it off to prosecutors. Then it's their job. We have nothing to do with it. The case gets overturned later, someone gets acquitted at a jury trial, whatever. That's the prosecutor's job. Nothing to do with us anymore. And there's no accountability or no particular feedback if terrible errors come to light years later. And we have more prosecutors' offices that are adopting conviction integrity units, taking on some of the onus. Some of them do much more than others, but at least there's this idea that in the DA's office, if we're doing our jobs right and if we're doing justice, we should be looking back at our old work and potentially correcting errors. No such thing exists in policing agencies in this country. And the idea that you do an automatic audit review, potential discipline for officers, like you would if it was a bad shooting, that doesn't exist in policing in this country. And it needs to. Certainly some policing organizations have started to raise alarms about this, and I hope that the message gets out.
Thank you so much. Jia, there's a question from a viewer, but I'm going to combine it with a question that I had earlier that I had skipped over. The question from the audience member is about, what other advocacy work are you doing? And I was actually going to ask you, and can sort of combine these responses. You were doing a Q&A for the Greenwich International Film Festival, and you hinted at a possible series of films profiling other wrongful conviction cases. So I guess maybe I'm wondering if you can, tell us, is that something that we should be looking out for? And is that a part of advocacy work, or are you doing other advocacy work as well?
So that's a great question. All of my advocacy work will be through my films. The sole reason I went into filmmaking was to make films about wrongful convictions and shed light on this cause. And so those are the only types of films I'm making. As you know, the second film I'm working on is Jeff's feature length. I am in the process of researching and writing my third film, which is about somebody who's currently incarcerated. And that is really my ultimate goal, is to make films about people who are in prison now and who could use the help, either just to tell their side of the story and get their voice heard, or, ideally for us to help with some of the investigation research and dig up some new facts that could essentially help them in the end. That's really what I would like to do with my films. And so that's what we're working towards now. And to answer your other question about the series, that was my goal from the get-go, because Jeff's story obviously is so compelling and all the work he does now is so important. I wanted the first episode, which is kind of what, like the short that you saw, but a 45-minute version of it, to be the first episode of the series, and then that go into Jeff's advocacy work and focus on one of the people he's currently working with to free, and then go on to other cases that Jeff is working on. That is what we're going to be pitching to networks now. What happens is going to be up to whether the networks want to buy that, or just a 2-hour film. So we'll see how that goes. But that's my goal. That's what I hope happens.
Just to just add a point that's related to that, one of the questions in the chat was, did I meet any other prisoners that were innocent, and what led me to that conclusion? So just for context, according to the National Registry of Exonerations, there have been 2,721 people exonerated to date. I did put the link in the chat, but there were 19. Yeah, there were like 19 people that I did time with that were exonerated either before me or after me. Only in one of those, only in 3 of those cases was I aware that they were innocent. Innocence isn't really something that's spoken about in prison, so it's kind of like 2 ships passing in the night. One person that I did know was innocent was Frank Sterling, and that was because I read his legal paperwork. He read mine. There was another false confession in it. There was an alternative suspect who had confessed to 4 different civilian witnesses, so he had something to hang his hat on as far as the innocence claim. I had the DNA test. So, Frank was ultimately exonerated a couple of years after me.
Thank you, both of you, for that. I want to actually start wrapping this up because it's 7:23 and we're getting. I appreciate so much the participation of all of our panelists and all of you that are listening in and watching and participating with your wonderful questions. And I know we couldn't get to every question. As I said, I have a list of questions that I never even got to ask as well. We're just going to ask, though, if the panelists would like to kind of offer any final thoughts as we close out. So, Jia, do you want to start us off? Any last minute thoughts or anything that you want to leave the audience with?
Not really, but this was so great, and it was so well done. And thank you all for being here. It was an honor to be here next to Brandon, Jeff, Sam, all of you. It was great.
Thank you. And I really, it's been an honor to get to know you and to be able to see your work. And I just want to mention to people who don't know, teach at Ossining High School, and I teach a course on criminal justice and incarceration. And I had the wonderful opportunity of screening the film Conviction for my students, and followed by a virtual visit from both Jeffrey and Jia, who spoke to the students in my 2 classes after they'd seen the film. So it was, this is really a wonderful thing that they are doing, and their willingness to share Jeffrey's story in this way has been very impactful for me in my life and also for my students, and I appreciate it very much. Brandon, any last kind of thoughts if you want to,
No, I'll just mention that Jia was talking about some of her upcoming work and Jeffrey his. I have a book coming out in March called Autopsy of a Crime Lab, which is a detailed walk through all the different ways that forensics can go wrong in criminal cases. I mean, in Jeffrey's case, there was DNA sitting right in front of them, and the confession somehow overwhelmed forensics that had been done. But in many exonerees cases, it was highly misleading, unreliable forensics that contributed to the conviction in the first place, and not just playing down the exculpatory results, but really problematic matchy forensic evidence. And a lot of people have a hard time understanding that fingerprints can go wrong, firearms evidence can go wrong, and does. So it's an expose of the quality problems in our crime lab system. So I'm working on that, also continuing to do research on how can we convey these issues to jurors better, whether it's problems with forensics, eyewitness evidence, or confessions evidence. And so, working on that work. How can we give lawyers better tools to educate jurors? There's lots to do. And thank you again for having me. It's a real treat to get to connect with Jeffrey again, at least on Zoom. And it's wonderful to Zoom meet you, Jia. I really can't wait to see more of your work in the future.
Thank you, Brandon. Yeah, I was able to quickly get a copy of Convicting the Innocent and read that, but I'm looking forward to reading the rest of your work, especially this new upcoming book that you have coming out. Jeff.
Sure. So, yeah, absolutely. So I would be remiss if I didn't mention that my last 28 days was actually spent in Sing Sing. I went to court from there and went home from there. In the course of my being a law student at Pace Law School, I took a class on prisoners' rights, and a portion of the grade involved doing a tour of Sing Sing. So that was kind of an unusual experience for me also. So I did want to mention those two Sing Sing crossovers. I guess my biggest point is, it could happen to you. While minorities, if you were to crunch the numbers, it happens more frequently there. African-American males are 7 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of murder, 3.5 times more likely to be wrongfully convicted of a sexual assault. That having said that, this does cut across color lines as well. There's no real particular walk of life that you can do that categorically exempts you. So, I do see this as a public safety issue. Each time the actual perpetrator, the wrong person is wrongfully convicted, the actual perpetrator is free to strike again. That does happen in my case. There is definitely a application of restorative justice to wrongful conviction in terms of society trying to restore the exonerated person back as best they can through the reentry and having compensation and issuing apologies, which often don't get issued. Certainly law enforcement apologizing to the second victim's family. And, I have yet really for them to apologize to the exoneree or their family, but, there is that application on that, and hope everybody, take some action after tonight. Do something, okay? Anything on your level. And if you go on to become a lawyer, then at least one time, right? Just one time in your legal career, take on one wrongful conviction case pro bono. And, I walked the walk. I became a lawyer, and I'm working on wrongful conviction cases now. So if I can do it, everyone else out there can do it.
Jeff, you mentioned going into Sing Sing, and that must have been a surreal experience as a student. I think I was with you one of the first times you returned to Peekskill High School after all those years of not, since you had been taken out of there when you were wrongfully convicted. Which was weirder? Going to Peekskill High School or going back to Sing Sing?
A tie. It was definitely a tie. But what I liked about it is, that both there and, like the professor didn't have an ego. Like he was readily asking me questions and letting me kind of in effect co-teach the tour. And, the same thing in the class, he'd read case law and explain things. And then but Jeff, got to ask you, is this what it actually is like? And like, no, this doesn't quite work exactly in the same way. The application of the law doesn't quite work that way. So both of them are weirder. And look, for all my laughter and advocacy and everything else, there is a part of me that's sad. And when I go to Peekskill High School in particular, or even any other high school, particularly there, because I once walked those hallways, and I see the high school students and they're going to class and they're running and they're talking and joking, and like, I feel like I lost that. I lost some of that. I can never catch that back. And so that aspect of it does still, I do still feel something like that. But I try to shrug that off. And I just think, look, my place in the world is to fight wrongful conviction and do other criminal justice reform work. And I make sense of everything in that kaleidoscopic way. And that's the thing that I'm most proud of with respect to conviction, and I'm so grateful that, Jia left that content in, because she's the creator. I'm not. I don't make any of the creative decisions. That's her wheelhouse. But while I was being interviewed, I made sure that I thought about the prisoners I left behind. I talked about compassionate release and elderly prisoners and prison reform, and college education for prisoners in solitary confinement and mass incarceration and over sentencing. And all those things matter so much to me. We need to make those changes too. Those are very important. And to that extent, in conviction, I try to carry water for those, also those really important issues. And speaking of that, contact your elected officials. There's 2 bills right now the legislature, is considering. One's called elderly parole, which would guarantee that any prisoner there who has reached the age of 55 and has also served 15 years of their sentence, they would get a review. They would just contemplation of release on parole. And then there's also Fair and Timely Parole Act, which basically it would stop the parole board from, they wouldn't be allowed to say, well, we're denying you parole based on the nature of the crime. They would actually have to give a written decision. Why is it that they think that you haven't been rehabilitated? So it would make that more fair. So we need to build more support. We need, if the electeds don't hear from the general public, those bills aren't going to pass. So we do need that work. And I'm really happy to be doing a lot of volunteer work with RAP, Release Our Aging People in Prison organization, which is spearheading that along with Vocal.
Thank you so much, Jeffrey. And thank you to all of our panelists. It's really been an honor to hear your stories and get your wisdom. And I'm going to turn it over now to Brent Glass to put the final touches on our presentation for tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sam, and thanks to the panel for your amazing presentations tonight. Thanks, Jeff and Jia, and to Brandon, and of course to you, Sam, for organizing the panel. I just wanted to comment how much this panel and this program reinforces our mission as a criminal justice museum, where we want to foster the kinds of conversations that we're having tonight. When Jia mentions the book Hurricane, I have thought about the extraordinary song by Bob Dylan about the same case, which he recorded in the 1970s, and then the film Thin Blue Line by Errol Morris in the 1980s. I recommend to everyone. This panel really reminds me of both of those creative works, the song and the film. This program will be on our Facebook page. It will also be available on YouTube. And I encourage anyone watching to sign up for our newsletter, which will tell you about other events and other activities coming up. We will have a program on Black History Month on February 18th about the connections between the Ossining African American community and Sing Sing. And so with that, I will say good night and thanks again to our panel and to our audience.